It has long stood as a bastion of justice, interpreting the Constitution and safeguarding the rule of law. But according to a recent poll, the majority of Americans no longer have confidence in the Supreme Court making the right decisions on legal cases related to the 2024 elections. It's time to wake up, Washington. Faith in the country's highest court continues to crack. Even more Americans are questioning its impartiality and integrity after some high-profile rulings and cases, from abortion to January 6th. And lawmakers are putting the court under the microscope.
The 9 justices on the Supreme Court are members of a democratic form of government, not royalty.
This is about an ongoing effort to destroy this court.
They should be held accountable, as all public servants in the federal government are held accountable.
The justices have proven their sobriety and their judicial temperament.
These individuals continue to detonate the credibility of the United States Supreme Court.
But how much of this is political? We spoke to Americans from across the country to see how they are feeling about the nation's highest court.
I don't have very much trust in the Supreme Court. I think that there should be term limits. I think it's time to reform the Supreme Court.
The American people need to be able to trust you as an impartial arbiter of the law, and right now it just doesn't look that way.
I think there should always be a code of conduct, and ethics should definitely be involved.
Well, it's not the Supreme Court that I trust. It's the people that's in the Supreme Court.
I don't see where we're going to go forward with any meaningful movement in government if all we're doing is, clan against clan, warring against each other, trying to get our way.
Joining us now, Princeton University political scientist Dr. Wright and constitutional law expert, criminal defense, and civil rights lawyer Robert McWhirter. Both of you, thank you so much for joining us. I want to go over some recent stats. The Supreme Court's approval rating fell to a record low of 40% in 2021 after it refused to block a controversial Texas abortion law prior to overturning Roe versus Wade in 2022. And a more recent Gallup poll has the court's approval rating at only 41%. Robert, I want to start with you. How concerning is this lack of faith in our country's highest court, and have we seen this at any other point in U.S. history?
Well, I think it's very concerning. I don't think it's surprising given what some of the justices have done and where their opinions have gone, but it's very concerning because, faith in the court is part of the rule of law. We depend on the court to kind of be the final arbiter of the great just issues of our day, and we want them to be fair and feel like they're balanced. As far as in the past, the Supreme Court has suffered worse. Right after the Dred Scott decision in 1857-58, the court suffered, and after the Civil War, the court kind of suffered for some time because of its adherence and acceptance and approval of the doctrines of slavery. That when the country moved in a different direction, they kind of had a pro-slavery group cemented into the court, and so the court lost tremendous prestige at that point. But over time, it's kind of rebuilt that. But right now, it's at a phase where, at least in modern history, it's never quite been this low, and that's problematic.
Yeah, it seems like there's some eerie similarities there in terms of, during the Dred Scott decision and today, the country was very, very divided in both periods. So definitely concerning to see that trend. Lauren, 39% of people say the high court is too conservative. Do you think the Supreme Court has risked turning into a political institution in recent years, or has it already turned into a political institution with candidates for president constantly invoking the nominations of justices?
Well, of course, it's been perceived as political, but there's very little the court can do to change that because the lifetime appointments or the appointments on good behavior, as the Constitution has it, are cemented in stone. And so that's actually to protect the court from the whims of popularity, to keep the independence of the justices. And so, it's expected that at certain times it'll be more or less popular. But yes, absolutely, the signals are there. The appointment process, for one, has become extraordinarily politicized. The president's staff and resources poured into these Supreme Court appointments are as political and as huge as they've ever been. And that appointments process has become fodder for national conversation. We can also very reliably predict the votes of justices just depending on the party they were appointed by. But I'll just provide, some context by saying the White House would be happy with a 40% approval rating a lot of the time. Congress would be thrilled. They have a 13% approval rating, and that's the lowest it's been in more than 10 years. And so even though the Supreme Court is suffering, and a lot of people do perceive it as untrustworthy, it's not as bad as some of our other institutions, believe it or not.
That's very, very important context. Thank you for pointing that out. Robert, I want to move on to how some of the individual justices themselves have found themselves in the political spotlight. We know there have been calls for Justice Samuel Alito to recuse himself in the upcoming January 6th cases after multiple flags seen at the January 6th insurrection were spotted flying at two of his homes. What's the case for recusal here? And do you see Alito reversing his decision in the future not to recuse himself?
Well, to pick up on your last question, I do not see Samuel Alito ever recusing himself on this. I think that Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas feel like this is their moment. They have waited for decades to get the votes on the court to do what they want to do with the cases they want to do it. And I don't see them ceding that for any reason. As far as the issue with the flag, it just looks bad. Those are clear political statements, and justices work very hard to avoid that. Now, he is saying that his wife did it. Look, I mean, if you're a Supreme Court justice, your spouse kind of has to be careful too. They have free speech rights, and everybody knows that. Maybe that's a marital issue between the two, or maybe Justice Alito just really actually doesn't care because he knows he's untouchable. The odds of him getting impeached in the current political environment for that issue are very low. And as Ms. Wright just noticed, he does have life tenure. And life tenure doesn't mean what it used to mean because people live a lot longer now. So life tenure means a long time for these justices. So I don't see him stepping down. And I think he's just going to go right on forward because this is his chance to re-engineer America the way he sees it. And Clarence Thomas is right there with him. His wife, Jenny Thomas, has tremendous problems and is potentially going to be indicted. But he is perfectly happy to sit on that court, and there's really nothing you can do to dislodge them.
So, Lauren, on that point of the Thomases and the Alitos and really any spouse of a Supreme Court justice politically, how does that, how do justices handle this issue of the free speech of their spouses, or how should they handle this? Is there really any guidance?
No, there's really not. And I've written a book on first ladies, and so I'm keenly aware of the power of political spouses, and especially over how institutions are perceived. But there's not much the justices can do about this, except in the capacity of their personal relationships at home. But it does have an extraordinary negative impact on the way the court's perceived. And so it does hurt the view of the institution, which, as we just talked about, is actually a little bit better than Congress, a little bit better than presidents in recent years.
So, Robert, I want to move to a slightly different topic. President Trump has called on the Supreme Court to decide his hush money case. How much of a long shot is that? And does it put the court in yet another difficult spot politically?
To say it's a long shot is actually an understatement. What would have to happen is Donald Trump would have to, through years and months and years, go through the entire appellate process of the state of New York. Then he would have to file some kind of habeas corpus motion or something like that in federal court, alleging that some kind of federal constitutional right was violated, which is pretty dubious even at that. And then it would have to go through the federal court process before it would ever get to the Supreme Court. There is a possibility that the Supreme Court could reach down and grab it from a federal district court, but there's really no precedent for or law that allows them to reach down and grab a case out of a state court, except in the most rare of circumstances would that ever happen. So I just don't think that happening. And the voices on the court for a kind of more measured approach, such as John Roberts, would be opposed to doing such a radical procedural departure as all of a sudden deciding this for Donald Trump. It just has a bad look. I mean, it's kind of like, well, I put 3 of the justices there, so they're beholden to me, so they should take care of my New York trial. That's kind of a bad look, and if the court is sensitive to its own legacy, they should really avoid that. And I just don't see a procedural mechanism for pulling it off.
Lauren, I want to ask you about the relationship between the justices and Capitol Hill, specifically Senate Democrats. We know that Democrats in the Senate Judiciary Committee had asked John Roberts, the Chief Justice, to meet with them over the Alito scandal and controversy. But John Roberts said he would not meet with them. Should he have granted them a meeting, or would it have been seen as too political ultimately?
It would have been perceived as political, and that's what his reasoning was. He's well known as a fierce protector of the independence and the reputation of the court, and so he really leaned on that. And he said, except for rare ceremonial occasions, we should not have these kind of meetings. And because only one political party is present, that's all the more reason to avoid it. So that's understandable. And there are some positive things here, Julia. The court is dominated by conservatives, of course, but on huge issues recently, like immigration, Native American rights, voting rights, the influence of state legislatures in our elections, they have voted with some of the liberal justices. And Kavanaugh, for instance, the most contentious hearing we've perhaps ever seen, votes with Justice Jackson over 60% of the time. He votes with some of his conservative members, Thomas, for instance, less than 50% of the time. So there are a lot more alliances than we often give the court credit for.
Yeah, I would encourage our viewers to look at those voting records and see where the justices are falling. So, Robert, where does the court go from here, and how can it regain the trust of Americans, no matter what part of the political spectrum they fall on?
Well, I think the court right now, by design, and this has been a design from the Federalist Society and Mitch McConnell and his allies for decades, to get the court that they want to get. I think there has to be a little more balance on the court for it to be back kind of in the mainstream. It's not just out of the mainstream of, I think, the American people, but it's out of the mainstream of most political thought, most kind of scholarly thought. This is a court that is way, way to the right of America and way to the right of the consensus about a lot of issues. This is a court that's hearing issues that nobody even thought would be subject for discussion before. And I think you have to have some balance put back in the court. The big example, and you could give many others, is the Dobbs decision overturning Roe versus Wade, is an opinion that is really far to the right of where the American people are, as is evidenced by what's been happening in the political process as we've gone on. So I think to regain that trust, the court has to be brought more back toward the middle, so it can be viewed as kind of a fair broker on these issues.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. Robert McWhirter and Lauren Wright, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Great pleasure.